Retrospective. From the re-embedding of the subject to the relapse into total care. If one looks back from these current, all too current perceptions to the long way travelled by modern forms of subject-forming practice, from their beginnings in urban mysticism, the workshops of artists and craftsmen, the studios of scholars and the offices of the early Renaissance, to the educational institutions, art galleries, fitness centres and genetic laboratories of the present, we arrive, beyond the unsummarisable wealth of divergent lines of development, at a problematic overall finding. Certainly the modern age fulfilled one of its promises, for the escapist ethicists populating the millennia between Heraclitus and Blaise Pascal, between Gautama Buddha and Totapudi. It opened up the possibility of a new existence as worldlings. In keeping this promise, however, it simultaneously took away from humans what many had considered most valuable: the possibility of distinguishing oneself radically from the world. One cannot deny that modernity ended the alienation between the enclaves of the secessionists and the wasteland of externalities, and provided a new description of the discrepancy between humans and beings in partly pathological, partly political, and partly aesthetic terms. It offered therapies on the first track, social reforms on the second, and emergences into creativity on the third. Do we still need to point out that these main directions of world improvement and self-improvement are simultaneously the modes that helped us to resolve most of the misunderstandings concentrated in the concept of, quote-unquote, religion? When it comes to correcting the disproportion between humans and the world, the most powerful mediators are medicine, the arts, and democracy, better described as the politics of friendship. And when the concern is to redirect the forces of escapism towards a beneficial immanence, a fulfilling world on this side provides enough light to outshine the special effects of the beyond. But regardless of whether modernity sought to adapt humans to the demands of the conditions or vice versa, its aim was always to bring back those who had voluntarily become estranged from the world in their secession from the country home of the self to quote-unquote reality. Its ambition was to imprint on them a single citizenship that gives and takes everything, being in the world. It binds us to a communal life that knows no more emigration. Since living there we all have the same passport, issued by the United States of Ordinariness. We are guaranteed all human rights, except for the right to exit from facticity. Hence the meditative enclaves gradually become invisible, and the residential communities of unworldliness disband. The beneficial deserts are abandoned, the monasteries empty out. Holiday makers replace monks, and holidays replace escapism. The demi-mondes of relaxation give both heaven and nirvana an empirical meaning. The re-secularization of the ascetically withdrawn subject, which is erroneously elevated to a substance, is undoubtedly one of the tendencies in modernity that merits close philosophical attention. In fact, it initiated a change that can be followed with sympathy, as it held out the prospect of nothing less than a reconciliation of humans and the world after an era of radical alienation. The age of balance made the negation of ancient opposites its mission. The spirit and life wanted to come together again, while ethics and the everyday wanted to form a new alliance. Millennia had passed in which the individuals resolved to embark on secession split the totality of the world into inner and outer, own and non-own parts. Now they would be re-embedded in the milieu of a multi-dimensional whole, each one in its place and grasping itself as the worldling in the middle, to draw once again on Goethe's cheerful self-description. When the Enlightenment drove forward the disenchantment of metaphysics, it did so not least with the aim of freeing those indoctrinated with notions of the beyond from their extravagant immersion in worldless fictions. What made the critics of the religious illusion so sure of their cause was the conviction that the alienated human race could only achieve emancipation and true happiness by renouncing all imaginary happiness. Taken together, these efforts form the complex of forms of the practicing life that I have outlined here under the classification, quote-unquote, exercises of the moderns. Their key figures were the technical, artistic and discursive virtuosos who, in extensive practice cycles, managed to produce themselves as worlds in the world, as microcosms, as personalities. These elaborated, stylized and documented individuals could be sure of experiencing the wide world inside their own person. All of them still profited from a metaphysical reinsurance that made the turn to worldliness appear as a gain on the account of the heightened and spared ego. For them, experience was synonymous with development. They could still enjoy the glowing isolation that guaranteed the separated subject a seemingly inalienable right of domicile in the realms of the soul and the mind. From there they organised the journeys into the open, conquistadors and beautiful souls in one. It was at them that Goethe directed his pronouncement. No time there is, no power can decompose the minted form that lives, and living grows. The rest is quickly told, for it is untellable. The radicalized enlightenment of the 20th century broke open the enclosures of quote-unquote personalities, immunized as figures or with reference to the beyond. Along with the soul that it posited for itself, it simultaneously drove out its daemon, the eerie companion from which Goethe borrowed the confidence that every individual life follows its inner primal form in accordance with, quote, the law presiding at your birth, end quote. This expulsion, too, initially occurred for the sake of inner worldly bliss, which was entitled to demand the sacrifice of various illusions. A particular concern was to end the priority of the soul, which had become a prison for the body. The true price of the epochal operation is revealed by the aberrances of the last century. If one were to compress this era into a film script, its title would have to be The Secularization of the Inner World, or The Revenge of the World on Those Who Thought that They Could Remain Untouched by It. It would demonstrate that humans are destined for mass consumption as soon as one views them as a mere factor in the game of world improvement. The plot would be centred on the symmetrically interrelated primary ideologies of the 19th and 20th centuries, which advanced the retranslation of humans from world flight into world beginning. Naturalism and socialism, one could, because of their close kinship, also say social naturalism and natural socialism. Both systems strove to reclaim humans along with their physical foundations entirely for the, quote, ensemble of social relations, end quote, and to prevent their flight into supposed inner worlds or counter worlds, to say nothing of religious back worlds. Both approaches are inseparable from an elemental pragmatism, which states that a thing is only real if it can be treated in social actions and technical procedures. It is augmented by a relentless moralism, indeed an inclination towards moral demonic excess. If humans can no longer succeed in distancing themselves spiritually from worldly conditions, then countless people at least do everything they deem necessary so that, under the given conditions, they can count themselves among the good, the morally superior. The decisive blow to the mere possibility of an existence capable of world flight did not come from the pragmatic side, however, but from the renewed quote-unquote revolution in the way of thinking in the early 20th century associated with the young Heidegger. He turns the clock of philosophical reflection back more than 2.5 millennia when he decided, in his principal work, Being and Time, 1927, to let philosophical thought begin anew in the situation of design as being in the world. He thus reversed the step into the aloof realm of theory, and with it the securing of the self in a distant observing position, the step that, reusing Heraclitean images, I described as stepping out of the river of life and conquering the shore. On the shore we saw the appearance of the observer whose gaze transformed the world into a spectacle. An undignified one, of course, from which the ethically motivated intelligence must turn away. Through this new approach in the midst of the comprehensive situation that is being in the world, the greenhouses of the inner world illusion were shattered, and the lodges of pure observation sank in the flood. The separated subject found itself demoted to design and stripped of its theoretical privilege, namely its similarity to the observer gods. It was immersed anew in the sea of moods that open up and colour pre-logically the whole in which we reside. This brought to light once more how far the human being as an organ of existence is disposed towards being outside oneself. Its mode of being is self-forfeiting, as it always already occurs as being among things, and being with others. In its spontaneous quality, the human being is a marionette of the collective and a hostage of situations. Only at the quote-unquote second reading, after the event, and exceptionally, does design return to itself and its possible mandate of self-being, and all attempts to elevate this later discovery to a first substance, a primal form, a world axis rising from the ego, show traces of subtle forgeries. Just as Proudhon declared, whoever says God seeks to deceive, we can conclude from Heidegger, whoever says I seeks to deceive themselves. Through their symptomatic prematurity, these over-elevations of the self betray an interest in rescue from the torrential flow of time. Is it necessary to emphasize that the longing for rescue does not in itself prove the possibility of rescue? The consequences of the shift are as unforeseeable as the conditions of the coming age, which, whatever else it might be, can only be referred to as the age, quote-unquote, after this one. One observation at least does suggest itself. The re-secularization of the withdrawn subject did not fulfill the expectation that abstaining from imagined bliss directly contributed to physical or actual happiness. The reason for this can be found in Heidegger's description of the design re-embedded in the worldly situation. The price for the new beginning of a thinking orientation from the position of being in the world is inevitably a loss of distance, whose main symptom is the handing over of humans to concern and their immersion in the lived situation. Whoever turns the subject back into design replaces the withdrawn with the included, the collected with the scattered, the immortalized with the de-immortalized, the redeemed and the unsaved. What Heidegger calls concern, Sorge, is the concession of humans to the world that they cannot seal themselves off from its infiltration. The shore on which the observer wanted to establish themselves is not a genuine rescue. Factical existing is, quote, always also absorbed in the world of its concern, end quote. However it might attempt to protect and isolate itself, as Atman, as the noetic psyche, as homo interior, as an inhabitant of the inner citadel, as a soul spark, as an underlying subject, as a present ego, as a personality, as an intersection of archetypes, as a floating point of irony, as a critic of the context of delusion, and as an observer of observers. Its constitutive being outside itself, in fact, means that it is always already in the grip of concern. Only the gods, and fools with them, are without concern in themselves. Design is colonized by worldliness from the start, because it is always already absorbed in concern. It must draw up lists of priorities and work through them, as if this were its innermost aim. Attempts to gain distance can never be more than secondary modifications of a self-delivering that anticipates everything else. The externalities Marcus Aurelius claimed stand outside our doors have in reality occupied the house. Its supposed master is possessed by the guests, and he can count himself lucky if they allow him a corner to which he can retreat. Thus, everything suggests that after 3 millennia of spiritual evasions, human existence has been taken back to the point where the secessions began, and is little the wiser for it, or at least barely faces less difficulty. This impression is simultaneously correct and incorrect. Correct insofar as the exuberance of surreal assents, hungry for a world beyond, has neither stood the test of time nor stood up to analysis, but incorrect because the treasuries of practice knowledge are overflowing, despite being rarely frequented in recent times. Now it is time to call to mind anew all those forms of the practicing life that continue to release salutogenic energies, even where the over-elevations to metaphysical revolutions in which they were initially bound up have crumbled. Old forms must be tested for reusability and new forms invented. Another cycle of secessions may begin in order to lead humans out once again. If not out of the world, then at least out of dullness, dejection and obsession. But above all out of banality, which Isaac Babel termed the counter-revolution.